The moonless night of November 12, 1943, began like many others for the men aboard the Japanese convoy High 31. 17 merchant vessels laden with critical supplies for Imperial forces, escorted by 3 destroyers and a single patrol boat, sliced through the midnight waters of the Philippine Sea. Captain Takahashi Miyamoto of the lead escort vessel Naganami stood on the bridge, scanning the darkness with growing unease. Their route would take them through the Formosa Strait, a corridor increasingly known among Japanese sailors as Submarine Alley. What Miyamoto didn't realize was that American submarine commander Dudley Mush Morton and his USS Wahoo were already tracking them through the periscope, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. In the coming hours, this convoy would experience firsthand why Japan's maritime supply routes had become death sentences for thousands of sailors and why American submarines had transformed into the deadliest predators in the Pacific. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The Battle of the Pacific wasn't merely fought on tropical islands or in massive carrier duels. Beneath the waves, American submarines were systematically severing Japan's maritime lifelines in what would become one of the most successful submarine campaigns in military history. By 1943, the tide had turned decisively against Japan, not just on famous battlegrounds like Guadalcanal, but in a silent, remorseless campaign that targeted the very foundation of Japan's war machine, its maritime shipping. The origins of this underwater battle traced back to the fundamental geography of Japan itself. As an island nation with limited natural resources, Imperial Japan depended entirely on its merchant fleet to fuel its war effort. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from the Philippines, all had to cross vast ocean expanses to reach Japanese factories. Military planners in Tokyo had anticipated many challenges when launching their ambitious war, but they catastrophically underestimated the threat American submarines would pose to their maritime supply lines. Pre-war Japanese military doctrine had focused overwhelmingly on preparing for a climactic naval battle with the American fleet, following the teachings of naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan. The Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, expected to cripple American forces in a decisive engagement, then negotiate from a position of strength. Their planning largely dismissed the potential impact of a protracted submarine campaign against merchant shipping, exactly the strategy that would ultimately strangle their war effort. For the Americans, the approach was initially uncertain. The U.S. Navy entered the war with contradictory doctrines about submarine usage. Officially, submarines were expected to operate primarily as fleet scouts and to attack enemy warships rather than merchants. But as the war evolved and Japanese expansion reached its zenith by mid-1942, American submarine strategy crystallized into a clear directive: sever Japan's maritime lifelines by targeting its merchant shipping. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of submarine forces in the Pacific, COMSUBPAC, would oversee a transformation of American submarine warfare into a devastating commerce-raiding operation. The scale of Japan's vulnerability was staggering. Nearly 6 million tons of shipping carried raw materials from occupied territories to the home islands at the start of the war. Every factory, every aircraft, every bullet ultimately depended on materials transported by sea. Over 2,400 Imperial Japanese Army and Navy transports, freighters, and tankers would need to navigate increasingly dangerous waters as American submarines grew more numerous and their tactics more lethal. The Japanese merchant marine became the most vital and most vulnerable component of the entire Japanese war effort. For Captain Miyamoto aboard the Naganami that November night, these strategic calculations manifested as constant, grinding anxiety. His convoy, High-31, was carrying critical aviation fuel, bauxite for aluminum production, and rubber, all irreplaceable resources for Japan's war machine. Merchant captains under his protection had already reported disturbing sonar contacts throughout the afternoon, though no confirmed submarine sightings had occurred. Miyamoto had ordered a zigzagging course change every 15 minutes after sunset, the standard anti-submarine tactic, but in the darkness, maintaining proper convoy formation while executing these maneuvers proved challenging. The Imperial Japanese Navy's anti-submarine capabilities had been woefully neglected before the war. Training was inadequate, detection equipment primitive, and doctrine underdeveloped. Most critically, the Japanese had failed to develop an effective escort system for their merchant shipping. While Germany's Kriegsmarine had implemented convoy systems from the outset of hostilities in the Atlantic, Japanese naval leaders initially resisted convoying, believing it would slow transport time and waste naval resources. This decision proved catastrophic. Only by mid-1943, after devastating losses, did Japan systematically implement convoy procedures. Even then, escort vessels were too few, their crews insufficiently trained, and their equipment inadequate. The High-31 convoy represented the improved Japanese approach, with 4 warships escorting 17 merchants, but even this enhanced protection would prove insufficient against the evolving American submarine threat. The hunter stalking High-31 that night, USS Wahoo, represented the cutting edge of American underwater warfare. Under Commander Mush Morton, it had become one of the deadliest submarines in the Pacific. Morton had pioneered aggressive new tactics that transformed American submarine operations from cautious, limited engagements to relentless pursuit of enemy shipping. His methods sometimes courted controversy, but his results, over 19 ships sunk totaling more than 55,000 tons, had made him a legend in the silent service. Morton's tactical innovations included surfaced night attacks, penetrating harbors to strike anchored ships, and the down-the-throat shot, firing torpedoes directly at oncoming vessels. That night in the Formosa Strait, he had positioned Wahoo ahead of the Japanese convoy's projected course, surfaced to gain speed, then submerged to await his prey with a full battery charge. As High-31 approached, Morton counted the silhouettes through his periscope, 17 merchantmen in 4 columns, zigzagging in a disorganized pattern with destroyers positioned at the front, rear, and flanks. "Stand by for surface attack," Morton ordered, his voice calm in the control room. "We'll hit them from the quarter, take out as many as we can before they know what's happening." The coordinates were plotted, torpedo tubes flooded, and the submarine's 24 officers and men moved with the practiced efficiency of a crew on their 6th war patrol. The Wahoo carried the improved Mark 14 torpedoes with magnetic exploders, weapons that had overcome the notorious reliability problems that had plagued American submariners earlier in the war. Unaware of the approaching danger, the men aboard the Japanese merchant ships continued their anxious journey. For them, life at sea had become an exercise in constant dread. The typical Japanese merchant crewman by late 1943 had likely already survived at least one submarine attack or had lost friends and colleagues to American torpedoes. Working conditions aboard these vessels were brutal. Inadequate food, minimal medical care, and the ever-present knowledge that if torpedoed, rescue was unlikely. Unlike Allied practice, where merchant sailors remained civilians, Japan had militarized its merchant marine. Crews were under naval discipline, wore uniforms, and were considered combatants. This classification would have significant implications for how American submariners viewed their targets, though international law recognized merchant vessels carrying military supplies as legitimate military targets regardless of their crew's status. The human experience aboard these Japanese merchant vessels rarely appears in Western histories of the Pacific War. Many were poorly constructed, hastily commissioned ships with inexperienced crews. As Japan's shipping losses mounted, training time decreased, and sailors with minimal experience were thrust into the dangerous convoy routes. The average age of merchant crewmen steadily increased as military conscription claimed younger men. By 1943, many crews consisted predominantly of teenagers and men over 40. On the cargo vessel Ominasan Maru, the largest ship in Convoy High 31 at 8,200 tons, Chief Engineer Hiroshi Takahashi performed his midnight equipment check. At 52, he had spent 30 years at sea and witnessed Japan's rapid transformation from a struggling nation to an imperial power. His engine room team consisted of a 58-year-old assistant engineer and 3 boys, aged 16-17. They maintained the aging steam engines that powered the ship at a maximum speed of just 10.5 knots, too slow to evade a surface submarine. The cargo Takahashi's vessel carried represented Japan's increasingly desperate wartime priorities. The hold contained 6,000 tons of bauxite from the Philippines, essential for aluminum production for aircraft. The deck carried disassembled Zero fighter planes being transported for reassembly. Every item aboard directly supported the war effort, making the ship a legitimate military target despite the civilian origin of its crew. The Japanese merchant marines' wartime experience exemplified the increasingly grim situation facing Imperial Japan. By November 1943, over 700 Japanese merchant ships had already been sunk. Replacements couldn't be constructed quickly enough, forcing Japan to use increasingly obsolete vessels and even wooden ships for coastal traffic. The merchant marine suffered proportionately higher casualties than any other Japanese service branch, with over 30% of all mariners perishing during the war. In the conning tower of USS Wahoo, Commander Morton tracked the convoy through his periscope, waiting until the merchants were silhouetted against the faint moonlight reflecting off clouds on the eastern horizon. At 0147 hours, he gave the order, "Final bearing and shoot." The first torpedo launched with a blast of compressed air, followed by 4 more in rapid succession. Morton had aimed at 5 different targets, a technique he had perfected that maximized damage before the convoy could react with evasive maneuvers. The Japanese had only minimal warning. Aboard the destroyer Naganami, a sonar operator called out a detection. But before Captain Miyamoto could order evasive action, the first explosion illuminated the night. The torpedo struck the tanker Nichie Maru amidships, igniting its aviation fuel cargo in a massive fireball that temporarily blinded lookouts across the convoy. Secondary explosions followed as flames reached the ship's magazines. Within minutes, the Nichie Maru broke in 2 and sank, taking 45 crewmen with it. The convoy erupted into chaos. 3 more merchant ships had been hit, with varying damage. The Ominasan Maru took a torpedo near the stern that flooded the engine room, killed Engineer Takahashi and his entire team, and left the vessel dead in the water. The Ryushin Maru sank within 5 minutes of being hit, while the Hawaii Maru managed to stay afloat despite severe damage. Captain Miyamoto on the Naganami faced the escort commander's nightmare scenario. Multiple ships hit simultaneously while the attacker's position remained uncertain. Following doctrine, he ordered 2 of his escorts to begin rescue operations, while he and the patrol boat, Shimushu, hunted the submarine. But in the darkness, with burning ships creating both light and shadow, finding a submerged submarine proved nearly impossible. Morton took advantage of the confusion. While the Japanese escorts charged toward his last firing position, he slipped away underwater, circled behind the now scattered convoy, and prepared for a second attack. This tactic, which Morton had developed through trial and error, maximized the psychological impact on the Japanese while minimizing risk to his own vessel. The experiences of survivors from torpedoed Japanese merchants revealed the horrifying reality faced by these sailors. When the Hawaii Maru was struck, 19-year-old radio operator Toshio Yamada had been thrown against a bulkhead by the explosion. He described the aftermath. Water rushed in immediately. The lights failed, and in the darkness, men were screaming. Those of us who could move tried to reach the deck, but many were trapped below. I climbed the ladder with water already at my chest. When I reached the deck, the ship was listing heavily to port. The captain ordered us to abandon ship, but we had only 2 functioning lifeboats for over 40 survivors. Yamada would float for 19 hours before being rescued by a Japanese patrol boat. Many of his crewmates were less fortunate. Of the 38 men who survived the initial torpedo hit, only 11 would ultimately be rescued. The rest succumbed to exposure, injuries, or shark attacks, a common fate for survivors in the Pacific. The psychological impact of such experiences reverberated throughout the Japanese merchant marine, creating what some historians have termed torpedo neurosis, a constant, debilitating anxiety that affected performance and morale. 2 hours after his initial attack, Morton brought Wahoo to periscope depth for another strike. The convoy was now scattered, with several ships having fled the area entirely, abandoning the formation in hopes of individual survival. Exactly the outcome Japanese convoy procedures sought to prevent. Morton selected the largest visible target, the crippled Omanazan Maru, now listing badly but still afloat. 2 more torpedoes finished the job, sending the vessel and its valuable cargo to the bottom, along with 61 crewmen. As dawn approached, Morton made a final bold move. Rather than retreating after his successful night attack, he surfaced to pursue the remnants of the scattered convoy in daylight, using Wahoo's superior surface speed. This aggressive tactic, while risky, had become a hallmark of Morton's approach. He located 2 more merchant stragglers and sank both with torpedo attacks, bringing his night's total to 6 vessels sunk, over 33,000 tons of shipping. The human toll was staggering. Across the 6 ships, sunk from Convoy High 31, approximately 280 Japanese sailors perished. Most died in the initial explosions or went down with their ships. Some survived the sinkings only to die in the water, awaiting rescue that often came too late or not at all. The psychological impact on survivors and on the crews of vessels that escaped was profound and enduring. For the Japanese Naval Command, the disaster represented another piece of increasingly troubling evidence that they were losing the battle to maintain their maritime supply lines. Admiral Minaichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the report of High 31's losses with grim resignation. The month before, he had written to Imperial Headquarters, "The enemy is attempting to cut our supply lines, and we have not been able to devise effective countermeasures. If this situation continues, the defeat of the Empire is inevitable." Koga's assessment proved prophetic. The battle between Japanese convoys and American submarines would continue for nearly 2 more years, but the outcome was increasingly foregone. By war's end, American submarines would sink over 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, about 5.5 million tons of shipping. The submarine force, representing just 1.6% of U.S. naval personnel, would account for 55% of all Japanese maritime losses. These statistics, while impressive, fail to capture the human dimension of the underwater campaign. The story of Convoy High 31 and USS Wahoo provides a window into the terrifying reality faced by Japanese merchant sailors and the relentless determination of American submariners. Each side operated under difficult conditions, with Japanese merchantmen knowing they transported the lifeblood of their nation's war effort, while American submariners endured claustrophobic conditions and the constant threat of depth-charge attacks. For the submariners like Morton and his crew, success brought acclaim and the satisfaction of effectively striking at the enemy's vital resources. Yet the submarine war carried its own unique psychological burdens. Unlike surface warfare, submarine attacks often meant witnessing at close range, through periscopes, the human consequences of their actions, watching as ships broke apart and men struggled in the water. Some submariners developed what psychiatrists later identified as periscope trauma, nightmares and intrusive thoughts about the deaths they had witnessed and caused. The human cost extended beyond those killed in actual attacks. As Japan's shipping losses mounted, civilian populations in the home islands faced increasing shortages of food and basic necessities. By 1945, the average caloric intake in Japan had fallen to less than 1,800 calories per day. and malnutrition became widespread. The submarine blockade had effectively isolated Japan from its empire and was systematically starving both its war machine and its people. For Captain Miyamoto, the attack on High 31 represented personal and professional failure. Though he had followed doctrine and saved several vessels through his countermeasures, the loss of 6 ships under his protection would tarnish his record. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The enemy submarine attacked with unprecedented boldness, striking from multiple directions. Our detection equipment proved inadequate, and escort vessels too few to provide effective coverage for a convoy of this size." His recommendations for improved sonar and additional escort vessels would be acknowledged but largely unimplemented due to Japan's dwindling resources. The submarine that had wreaked such havoc, USS Wahoo, would continue its successful patrol for another week, sinking 3 additional vessels before heading back to Pearl Harbor. But fate would soon catch up with Morton and his aggressive tactics. On October 11, 1943, during their 7th war patrol, Wahoo was detected while attempting to exit the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait. Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the submarine with depth charges, killing all 80 men aboard, including the legendary Morton. The strategic impact of the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping cannot be overstated. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, would later observe, "It was to the submarine force that I looked to carry the load until our major fleet components were made good after Pearl Harbor. It is to the everlasting honor and glory of our submarine personnel that they never failed us in our days of great peril." The submariners had indeed carried that load at significant human cost to both themselves and their Japanese adversaries. By mid-1944, the situation for Japanese convoys had grown even more perilous. American submarine tactics continued to evolve, with coordinated wolfpack attacks modeled after German U-boat tactics becoming common. New technologies, including improved radar and the introduction of the deadly Mark 18 electric torpedo that left no telltale bubble trail, made American submarines even more lethal. Japanese countermeasures, including improved depth charges and escort tactics, proved too little and too late. The scale of the logistical challenge facing Japan by this point was insurmountable. Over 130 submarines patrolled the Pacific and East Asian waters, operating from bases at Pearl Harbor, Australia, and by 1945 even from the newly captured island of Guam. These submarines were supported by a sophisticated intelligence apparatus that tracked Japanese shipping through ultra-code breaking and provided regularly updated routing information. The hunters had every advantage, and the Japanese merchant marine was fighting a losing battle of attrition. The human dimension of this underwater battle revealed itself most poignantly in the logbooks and personal diaries of those who lived it. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, who served as an escort commander on the Tokyo to Singapore route, wrote in his memoir, "Each departure became a farewell ritual. Families gathered at the docks with quiet resignation. There were no tears. These had been exhausted long ago. Instead, there was a grim acceptance that this might be the final parting. By 1944, we calculated our survival chances at less than 50% for a round trip. Yet we sailed because Japan needed us to sail." For many Japanese merchant sailors, this fatalism manifested in powerful spiritual practices. Shinto and Buddhist rituals took on heightened importance. Many sailors carried omamori, protective charms, from hometown shrines. Small shrines to maritime deities appeared aboard vessels, tended carefully even during attacks. Some crews performed impromptu ceremonies for fallen comrades despite the haste of abandoning sinking ships. These practices reflected their desperate need for spiritual solace in circumstances where survival often seemed a matter of chance rather than skill. The Americans hunting these convoys experienced their own unique psychological landscape. Submarine duty was simultaneously the safest and most dangerous assignment in the U.S. Navy. Safest in that submarines spent much time avoiding combat, Dangerous in that when disaster struck, it usually meant the loss of the entire crew. This paradox created a distinctive submarine culture characterized by superstitions, rituals, and gallows humor. One American submarine commander, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb, described the psychological strain. Each patrol lasted about 2 months. You lived in a steel tube breathing recycled air, never seeing the sun. Most patrols were hours of monotony punctuated by moments of extreme danger. You trained constantly for emergency scenarios because underwater, a single mistake could kill everyone. The responsibility for 60 lives weighed constantly on commanders. When we attacked, we knew we were killing men not unlike ourselves, sailors doing their duty. Some skippers couldn't handle it and were quietly reassigned. Others became too aggressive, taking irrational risks. Finding balance was essential. The American submarine service attracted a particular personality type, independent thinkers comfortable with isolation and extreme responsibility. The psychological screening for submarine duty was among the most rigorous in the military. Claustrophobia, even mild, was disqualifying. So too was a hint of emotional instability or inability to function under extreme stress. The submarine qualification process, earning dolphins, the submarine warfare insignia, tested not just technical competence, but psychological resilience. By 1944, the submarine force had developed into an elite community with its own traditions, language, and outlook. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, struggled to develop effective countermeasures against the growing submarine threat. Their anti-submarine warfare, ASW, capabilities remained woefully inadequate throughout the conflict. Early in the war, Japanese depth charges were set to explode too shallow to damage deep-diving American submarines. Even after this deficiency was corrected, Japanese ASW doctrine remained reactive rather than proactive. Lieutenant Hideo Yamamoto, who served aboard the destroyer Akakaze as ASW officer, recalled the frustration. Our sonar equipment was primitive compared to the Americans. Detection ranges were short and false readings common. When we did locate a submarine, our attack patterns were predictable. American submariners learned to dive deep and turn toward the attacking destroyer, presenting the smallest target profile. Our depth charge patterns rarely compensated for this tactic. After many failed attacks, crews became discouraged, sometimes going through the motions without real hope of success. By late 1944, Japanese merchant shipping adopted increasingly desperate measures. Some convoys traveled only at night, hiding in shallow bays during daylight. Others hugged coastlines, staying in waters too shallow for submarine operations. Merchant ships were painted to blend with coastal landscapes when viewed through periscopes. Dummy wooden vessels with minimal crews were used as decoys. Valuable cargoes were distributed across multiple ships rather than concentrated, improving survival chances for at least some critical materials. These adaptations proved insufficient against evolving American tactics. Submarines began coordinating with aircraft to locate and track convoys. Wolfpack tactics, where multiple submarines attacked simultaneously from different directions, became standard practice. The introduction of specialized submarine rescue vessels allowed for more aggressive operations as commanders knew assistance was potentially available if they ran into trouble. The technical dimension of the underwater campaign showed the stark contrast in industrial capacity between the two nations. While Japan struggled to replace lost shipping and escort vessels, the United States commissioned submarines at an accelerating pace. The Balao and Tench-class submarines entering service by 1944 could dive deeper, had better weapons, and incorporated lessons learned from earlier combat experience. A technological race developed around detection equipment. Japanese vessels gradually received improved sonar sets, while American submarines added more sophisticated radar that could detect ships beyond visual range, even in darkness or fog. The Japanese responded with radar detection equipment that could warn when they were being scanned, but this only prompted American commanders to use radar more judiciously, activating it briefly, then changing position. American submarine success stemmed not just from technology but from organizational learning. After each patrol, commanders submitted detailed reports that were analyzed for tactical insights and distributed throughout the force. This systematic approach to capturing and disseminating combat lessons accelerated the development of effective tactics. In contrast, the Japanese naval hierarchy was less receptive to feedback from escort commanders, and institutional learning occurred more slowly. The human cost of this relentless campaign manifested itself in the growing crew shortages aboard Japanese vessels. As casualties mounted, experienced sailors became increasingly rare. Training programs were abbreviated to meet demand, resulting in crews with minimal practical knowledge. By mid-1944, many merchant vessels operated with crews at 70% of recommended strength, with key positions filled by hastily trained replacements. 17-year-old Akira Tanaka joined the Merchant Marine in April 1944 after just 6 weeks of training. His experience illustrated the deteriorating situation. "I was assigned as assistant engineer aboard the freighter Hokuroku Maru with almost no practical experience. My senior, a man of 50, had to teach me basic operations while we were already at sea. Our first convoy to the Philippines was attacked twice. During the second attack, I froze in panic when ordered to adjust steam pressure. The chief engineer had to physically push me aside to prevent a boiler explosion. 3 days later, he was killed when we took a torpedo hit in the forward hold. Suddenly, I was the engineer, responsible for systems I barely understood." The Japanese home front felt the impact of these shipping losses acutely. By 1945, imports of raw materials had fallen to less than 30% of pre-war levels. Industries essential to the war effort received priority allocations, while civilian needs went increasingly unmet. Food imports, which had supplemented domestic production, declined precipitously. Rice, the dietary staple, was strictly rationed at levels causing widespread malnutrition. Civilian accounts from this period describe the growing connection ordinary Japanese made between submarine attacks and their daily hardships. Kazuko Saito, a Tokyo housewife, wrote in her diary in February 1945, "Today, the rice ration was reduced again." The official announcement blames American submarines for sinking transport ships. "My neighbor's son was on a merchant ship torpedoed last month." No survivors were reported. Now, when we line up for our meager rations, I see his mother standing silently, her face showing no emotion. We are all learning this kind of endurance. The submarines are starving us slowly, more effectively than the bombs. The psychological warfare aspect of the submarine campaign was recognized by American strategic planners. Classified communications between Admiral Nimitz and submarine force commanders explicitly noted that beyond the material damage inflicted, the campaign was designed to undermine Japanese civilian morale by creating visible shortages. American submarines were sometimes ordered to target specific cargo types based on intelligence assessments of critical Japanese needs. As 1945 began, the situation for Japanese convoys had become virtually hopeless. American submarines now operated with near impunity, often attacking on the surface in daylight, using deck guns to conserve torpedoes for larger targets. Japanese escort vessels, critically short of fuel themselves, sometimes lacked the endurance to pursue attackers or conduct prolonged rescue operations. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, one of Japan's most experienced submarine officers who later became an escort commander, provided a candid assessment. By early 1945, sailing in convoy offered psychological comfort but little practical protection. Our anti-submarine doctrine had failed to evolve quickly enough. Escort commanders received impossible assignments, too many merchants to protect with too few escorts over too great a distance. American submarines operated with near-perfect intelligence about our movements, while we had little information about their deployment. It became a mathematical certainty that each convoy would lose ships. The final months of the war saw truly desperate Japanese countermeasures. Kaiboken, purpose-built escort vessels, entered service, but too few to make a difference. Remaining naval aircraft were prioritized for convoy protection, but lacked the range to provide continuous coverage. Merchantmen were armed with whatever weapons could be salvaged, though these proved largely ineffective against submarines that could attack from beyond their range. Perhaps most telling was the Japanese resort to coastal shipping, using wooden sailing vessels reminiscent of pre-modern times. Unable to protect blue water shipping lanes, the Imperial Navy recommended breaking cargo into smaller shipments carried by hundreds of wooden vessels operating in shallow coastal waters where submarines couldn't follow. This reversion to pre-industrial transportation methods symbolized the comprehensive defeat of Japan's maritime strategy. The submarine campaign reached its peak effectiveness in the summer of 1945. Operation Barney in June 1945 sent 9 submarines into the Sea of Japan, previously considered a safe haven for coastal shipping. Using the newly developed FM sonar to navigate minefields, these submarines sank 28 ships totaling over 50,000 tons in just 2 weeks. The psychological impact was devastating. No waters around Japan remained safe. A Japanese naval staff study completed in July 1945 concluded bluntly, "Our ability to transport essential materials has been destroyed." Military planners recognized that even if Japan's land forces could repel an invasion of the home islands, the nation would starve before victory could be achieved. This recognition contributed significantly to the decision to seek surrender terms after the atomic bombings in August. The effectiveness of the American submarine campaign is reflected in stark statistics. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. During the conflict, Japanese shipyards managed to build about 4.1 million tons of replacement vessels, but 8.9 million tons were sunk, the vast majority by submarines. The result was a net loss of 2.8 million tons, reducing Japan's merchant fleet to about half its pre-war capacity. Human casualties were equally staggering. Of approximately 122,000 Japanese merchant sailors who served during the war, over 27,000 perished, with submarines responsible for most of these deaths. The Japanese merchant marine suffered a higher casualty rate than any Japanese military service except kamikaze pilots. These losses represented not just numbers, but a devastating depletion of Japan's maritime expertise, skills cultivated over generations of seafaring tradition. American submarine casualties, while numerically smaller, represented a significant sacrifice. 52 submarines were lost during the war, with 3,506 submariners killed, about 22% of those who served in the submarine force. Their contribution to victory was recognized by Admiral Nimitz at the Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. "We shall never forget that it was our submarines that held the lines against the enemy, while our fleets replaced losses and repaired wounds." The stories of individual convoy battles like High 31 illuminate the human experience behind these statistics. By examining specific engagements, we gain insight into the terror experienced by Japanese merchant crews and the determined professionalism of American submariners. Each torpedo fired, each ship sunk. Each rescue attempt represented individual human dramas played out against the vast backdrop of the Pacific. For the Japanese sailors who survived torpedo attacks, the experience often left psychological scars that lasted a lifetime. Toshio Hasegawa, who survived 3 sinkings as a radio operator, described the lasting impact. "For decades after the war, I could not sleep without first placing a life jacket beside my bed. The sound of distant thunder would send me into panic." When asked about my war experience, I could speak of battles and campaigns objectively, but I could never describe what it felt like to be in the water, watching your ship sink, hearing your comrades call for help in the darkness. Those memories remained too raw. American submariners, too, carried their experiences forward. The unique brotherhood forged in underwater service created powerful bonds. Submarine veteran associations became among the most active military organizations after the war. Many spoke of how submarine service had fundamentally changed their character, teaching patience, attention to detail, and the ability to function under extreme pressure. The technical and tactical lessons of the submarine campaign influenced post-war naval development globally. The demonstrated vulnerability of surface vessels to underwater attack accelerated the development of increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The submarine itself evolved from primarily a commerce raider to a capital ship in its own right, eventually becoming the primary platform for nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. The human lessons were equally profound. The Japanese experience demonstrated the existential vulnerability of island nations dependent on maritime commerce, a lesson that shaped Japan's post-war economic and defense policies. The American experience validated the strategic concept that wars could be won by targeting economic infrastructure rather than solely engaging enemy military forces, an approach that would influence future conflicts. For historians, the submarine campaign offers a case study in asymmetric warfare. A relatively small force operating with technological advantage and sound doctrine systematically defeated a much larger opponent by attacking critical vulnerabilities. The campaign demonstrated that victory does not always require matching an enemy's strength, but can instead be achieved by exploiting their weaknesses. The human stories of those who experienced this underwater war firsthand provide a window into an often overlooked aspect of World War II. Behind the strategic calculations and tonnage statistics were tens of thousands of individual experiences, moments of terror, courage, desperation, and resilience. Their stories remind us that history is not merely the movement of faceless forces, but the aggregate of human actions and reactions under extraordinary circumstances. The legacy of the submarine campaign extends into contemporary maritime security concerns. Modern naval strategists study this historical episode when considering vulnerabilities in global shipping networks and developing countermeasures against potential disruptions. The campaign demonstrated how interruption of maritime commerce can have cascading effects throughout an industrial economy, a lesson with continuing relevance in our interconnected world. For the families of those lost on both sides, the submarine war's legacy was deeply personal. Japanese communities dependent on maritime employment saw entire generations of men disappear beneath the waves. American submarine bases like New London, Connecticut, and Pearl Harbor, Hawaii became focal points for commemoration of those lost on patrol. The submarine memorials established after the war provided places for reflection on sacrifice and service. Admiral Lockwood, who commanded American submarine forces through most of the war, later wrote, "Our submariners executed their mission with a determination and courage that exemplified the finest traditions of naval service. They went to sea in vessels that were technological marvels but still vulnerable to countless dangers. They faced an enemy who fought with skill and desperation to protect vital supply lines. The underwater campaign they conducted was decisive yet invisible to most Americans. Their story deserves to be remembered as a testament to what a small, elite force can accomplish when properly led, equipped, and motivated." The Japanese perspective was captured by Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, who commanded submarine operations and later anti-submarine efforts. The American submarine campaign was the single most decisive factor in our defeat. Our naval strategy failed to appreciate the vulnerability of our merchant shipping until it was too late. The lesson we learned at terrible cost was that naval power rests not just on battleships and carriers, but on the humble merchant vessel and the ability to protect it. This is a lesson we have carried into the post-war era and one that all maritime nations should heed. As the war in the Pacific recedes further into history, the human dimensions of the submarine campaign risk being forgotten. The terror experienced by Japanese merchant sailors as they scanned the horizon for periscopes, the claustrophobic tension aboard American submarines during depth charge attacks, the agonizing wait of families hoping for news of ships overdue at port. These emotional realities shaped the lives of all involved. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping represents a chapter of the Pacific War that illustrates how technological advantage, tactical innovation, and strategic focus can overcome numerical superiority. American submarines, never numbering more than 2% of U.S. naval personnel, inflicted disproportionate damage on the Japanese war effort. This asymmetric impact stemmed from the identification and relentless exploitation of a critical vulnerability, Japan's absolute dependence on maritime transportation. Perhaps no single engagement better exemplifies the nature of this underwater battle than the February 1944 attack on convoy Maru 31. This convoy of 11 merchant vessels escorted by 3 destroyers departed Singapore laden with rubber, bauxite, and oil, all strategic materials essential to Japan's war production. 5 days into their journey, as they entered the South China Sea, they were detected by a wolf pack of 3 American submarines, USS Harder, USS Pargo, and USS Snook, operating under coordinated command. The resulting 3-day battle illustrated the evolution of submarine tactics by this stage of the war. Rather than individual submarines conducting solitary attacks, the Wolfpack maintained continuous contact with the convoy, attacking in sequence to maximize confusion and prevent effective countermeasures. The first night, Harder struck, sinking 2 tankers. As Japanese escorts pursued, Pargo attacked from the opposite flank, sinking another merchant. By dawn, the convoy had scattered, with several ships breaking formation to flee independently, exactly what Japanese naval doctrine warned against. The Japanese escort commander, Lieutenant Commander Yasumi Togawa, faced an impossible dilemma: maintain formation with remaining ships or pursue those fleeing to provide protection. He chose to protect the core formation, abandoning the scattered vessels to their fate. This decision, while tactically sound, meant that isolated merchants became easy targets. By the 3rd day, 7 of the original 11 merchant vessels had been sunk and 2 more damaged. Only 2 reached port undamaged. A Japanese naval review conducted afterward concluded, "The American Wolfpack tactics render our current escort protocols ineffective. We lack sufficient escorts to counter simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Either escort strength must be dramatically increased or shipping volume reduced." But by 1944, Japan could do neither. Both escorts and merchant vessels were irreplaceable, yet both continued to be lost at unsustainable rates. The human consequences of this logistical strangulation became increasingly visible in Japan itself. Civilian accounts describe food shortages becoming severe by mid-1945. Caloric intake in major cities dropped below 1,500 calories per day. Industrial workers, needing energy for physical labor, received supplemental rations, but these too declined as imports dwindled. Medical supplies became scarce, with hospitals prioritizing military casualties over civilian needs. Even war production suffered, with aluminum output falling by 70% between 1944 and 1945 due to bauxite shortages, a direct consequence of submarine sinkings. Perhaps most telling was the Japanese government's implementation of the wood stove conversion program in early 1945. With liquid fuel imports virtually eliminated by submarine warfare, vehicles were modified to run on wood gas generated by onboard gasifiers. These cumbersome devices reduced engine power by 40–60% and required frequent stops to replenish wood supplies, but represented the only way to maintain minimal transportation capacity. The sight of trucks lumbering along with large wood hoppers attached became a visible symbol of Japan's technological regression under the pressure of the blockade. Former Japanese Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who served as Minister of Commerce and Industry during the war, later reflected, "By early 1945, we recognized that defeat was inevitable due to the supply situation. Our war production planning became theoretical rather than practical. We calculated requirements for weapons and equipment that we knew could never be produced due to material shortages." The submarine blockade had succeeded where diplomacy had failed before the war. It had effectively reversed Japan's industrial development and returned us to a pre-modern economy. For the American submariners who executed this campaign, their contributions often went unrecognized by the broader public during the war. Submarine operations remained classified, with successful patrols acknowledged only in the most general terms. The silent service remained truly silent about its methods and achievements. Only after the war did the full extent of the submarine campaign's impact become publicly known through naval studies and Japanese records. Commander Edward Beach, who served aboard several submarines during the campaign, wrote, "We operated in a world apart, rarely seeing other American forces. Our war was intimate. We could see our targets through periscopes, sometimes even the faces of men on deck. Unlike bombing from high altitude, there was no emotional distance from the consequences of our actions. We knew we were killing fellow sailors, men much like ourselves except for the flag they served. This created a complex psychological burden that each of us processed differently. Some focused entirely on the tactical challenge, others on the strategic necessity. But none of us emerged unchanged by the experience. The final months of the war saw Japanese maritime transportation reduced to a fragment of its former capacity. By July 1945, shipping between the home islands and overseas territories had effectively ceased except for high-priority military transport. Coastal shipping continued using small wooden vessels, but even these faced growing dangers from American air attacks. The submarine blockade had achieved its strategic objective. Japan was isolated from its conquered territories and the resources that had motivated its imperial expansion. When Emperor Hirohito met with the Supreme Council for the direction of the war on August 9, 1945, to discuss surrender, the shipping situation featured prominently in the deliberations. Records of this meeting indicate that while the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war were immediate triggers, the underlying resource crisis caused by the shipping losses was recognized as having already made continued resistance futile. The strategic bombing campaign had devastated Japanese cities, but it was the submarine campaign that had starved the war machine of resources needed for recovery and response. The post-war testimony of Japanese naval leaders confirmed this assessment. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister during the final year of the war, stated during interrogation, "We were defeated by your submarines, not your bombs. From the time the submarine campaign became effective, our war was lost. The damage to our shipping by submarines was the single most important factor in our defeat. It was impossible for us to counter it." This verdict has been largely upheld by subsequent historical analysis. While the Pacific War's narrative is often dominated by dramatic carrier battles and infantry assaults on island strongholds, the systematic destruction of Japan's merchant marine represented the most strategically decisive campaign. American submarines effectively exploited Japan's fundamental geographic vulnerability, its dependence on seaborne resources, in a campaign that combined technological superiority with tactical innovation and strategic patience. For the participants on both sides, American submariners hunting in dangerous waters and Japanese sailors attempting to deliver vital cargo through an increasingly deadly gauntlet, this undersea campaign represented war at its most elemental, a contest of skill, technology, and will with the highest possible stakes. Their experiences reveal the human dimension behind the strategic calculations and tonnage statistics, reminding us that history is ultimately the story of people facing extraordinary challenges under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The submarine campaign against Japanese shipping stands as one of history's most successful naval blockades, a demonstration of how control of maritime communications remains fundamental to modern warfare. Its legacy lives on in naval doctrine, maritime commerce protection protocols, and the strategic calculations of island nations dependent on seaborne trade. The terrifying reality faced by Japanese convoys as they confronted American submarines in the Pacific offers enduring lessons about vulnerability, adaptation, and the decisive impact of targeting an enemy's critical economic lifelines.